It was just another day in the courtroom, or so it seemed. The air was thick with the usual tension that accompanies any trial. Lawyers shuffled papers, the judge glanced over the case files, and the audience, mostly made up of curious onlookers and journalists, waited for the proceedings to begin. But today, something was different. Something that would alter the course of the entire trial. It was Clint Eastwood's presence. As Clint entered the courtroom, his strong, purposeful steps made every head turn. He wasn't here as a movie star. He wasn't here for any blockbuster film promotion or a red carpet event. Clint Eastwood was here as a witness. A former U.S. Secret Service agent and one of the most iconic figures in Hollywood, his role in this trial was about to add an unexpected twist. What he didn't expect, however, was the mocking remarks from the judge. Judge Harold Jenkins, known for his sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude, was about to put Clint in an uncomfortable spotlight. He smiled slyly as he looked over at the 94-year-old actor turned former agent. Well, Mr. Eastwood, the judge began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, I must say, it's not every day we have a witness with a past more interesting than the trial itself. How does it feel to be back in front of an audience, Mr. Eastwood? I imagine you're more accustomed to shooting bad guys on screen than answering questions in court. Laughter rippled through the room, a few chuckles from the lawyers and onlookers, and even a couple of reporters in the back looked up, nodding as if they had just witnessed a punchline. Clint, ever the professional, didn't flinch. He simply sat in his chair, composed, with a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. Your Honor, Clint began calmly, his gravelly voice carrying through the room, I'm here to testify about what I know. As for the rest, I leave the jokes to the comedians. The judge seemed to relish this moment, watching Clint like a predator eyeing its prey. Oh, don't worry, Mr. Eastwood, Judge Jenkins quipped, I'm sure there are plenty of bad guys to talk about, but let's focus on something even more interesting. How about we talk about the real action, your time as a U.S. Secret Service agent? Maybe you can share with us how you were able to save the president in that one film. It certainly had a great ending. More laughter. The audience was loving this. But Clint didn't react. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to speak again. You're mixing up fiction and reality, Judge. I was part of the U.S. Secret Service, but not for a movie. I did my job just like the rest of the men and women who serve. So, unless you want me to recount my service, I suggest we stick to the facts at hand. The judge's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. The tension in the room was palpable, but the audience could feel that Clint wasn't backing down. This wasn't the Clint Eastwood they were used to seeing on screen, the grizzled, action hero or the wise, tough cowboy. This Clint was measured, disciplined, and, above all, unflappable. As the courtroom settled into a heavy silence, Clint's stoic demeanor became the focal point. He wasn't here to entertain, and he wasn't going to allow his past to become the punchline of someone else's joke. But it wasn't just the judge who seemed to misunderstand Clint's purpose. It was the very nature of the trial that seemed to test his patience. The case itself was a complex one, a corporate fraud trial involving a large tech company. Clint had been called as a witness due to his role in overseeing a security operation years prior, and his testimony was crucial. Yet, here he was, being mocked by a man who clearly didn't grasp the gravity of the situation. It was almost as if the judge was more interested in Clint's fame than in the matter at hand. But Clint had seen it all. This wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him or misjudged his purpose. He had fought in wars, saved lives, and faced down dangerous criminals, both on screen and in real life. This trial? It was just another challenge. Another day in the life of a man who had lived through the kind of stories that would make most people cringe. The mockery continued. Mr. Eastwood, we all know your history with guns, Judge Jenkins continued, leaning back in his chair with a smirk, but this courtroom is about the law, not your shootouts. So, let's skip the cowboy talk and get to the real questions. A wave of amusement washed over the audience again. But Clint remained impassive. His reputation as an actor and former agent meant little to him now. He was here to do a job, and he would do it with dignity, no matter how childish the proceedings seemed. Then came the moment that changed everything. Just as Judge Jenkins was about to throw in another barb, Clint's expression shifted. His face, which had been neutral until now, grew more serious. Slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, official-looking badge. The silver gleamed under the courtroom lights, and the air seemed to freeze for a split second. Clint didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The badge read U.S. Secret Service Special Agent, an emblem of authority and power that left no room for mockery. As the judge's eyes locked onto the badge, his mouth went dry, his words catching in his throat. The room fell silent as the weight of the moment settled over everyone. Clint's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "You wanted to see the action, Judge. This is the real deal." In that instant, the laughter and mockery ceased. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. The people who had been snickering just moments ago now sat with wide eyes, unsure of how to react. Judge Jenkins, who had once been so confident, was now visibly rattled. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his next move. The moment had come, and Clint had just shown the true power he held, not through words, but through something far more impactful. The tables had turned. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The opening scene had set the tone for what was to come, a clash of egos, a battle of wills, and a journey that would take Clint, and everyone else in the courtroom, into uncharted territory. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was about to become a story of power, respect, and the unexpected twists that life often throws at us. Would Clint stand his ground, or would the judge find a way to regain control? The real question now was, who held the upper hand? And how far would Clint go to make sure the truth was heard? Clint Eastwood's life was a story of dual identities, one part actor, one part agent, with both roles leaving an indelible mark on the world. As a teenager, Clint had never imagined his life would take the path it did. Born in 1930 in San Francisco, he grew up with an unremarkable childhood, the son of a factory worker. His early life was filled with more ordinary challenges than grand moments, but he always had a stubborn determination to carve out something for himself. His first dream wasn't to be a Hollywood icon, it was to play football, a sport he loved, but a series of injuries and a growing sense that it wasn't his true calling led him to take another direction. Clint's entrance into the world of film came almost by accident. After working as a logger, a steel mill laborer, and even a lifeguard, Clint's true break came when he was noticed by a Hollywood agent while struggling to make ends meet. His first role in a movie was a minor one, a fleeting appearance that barely made a dent in the vast world of cinema. But his rough-around-the-edges charm and tough demeanor caught the attention of filmmakers who were looking for a new type of leading man. Clint's breakthrough came with the iconic Dollars trilogy, directed by Sergio Leone, where he became the man with no name. The world suddenly knew him as the rugged, stoic anti-hero, a character who would define an entire genre. But Clint's success was never just about the movies. His true test came much later in life, and it wasn't on a film set, it was with the United States Secret Service. While his acting career was booming, Clint had developed a strong sense of duty, something that wasn't always apparent to the public. His time as an actor brought him into contact with many people from all walks of life, but it also made him increasingly aware of how fragile public figures could be. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 had shaken the country, and Clint, like many, felt a deep sense of unease about the safety of public leaders. It wasn't long before Clint's interest in security and law enforcement led him to explore more serious, hands-on roles outside of film. In the mid-1970s, Clint was approached by the Secret Service, who had been looking to recruit individuals with unique skills, including actors, who could blend in and understand the psychology of high-profile figures. Clint, with his background in film and his physical prowess, seemed like the perfect candidate. While many saw Clint Eastwood as nothing more than a Hollywood star, those within the corridors of power knew him differently. Clint's skills were now in demand in a more covert setting. His years of acting had honed his ability to stay cool under pressure, to observe without being noticed, and to think on his feet. These qualities made him an excellent fit for the service, and soon, Clint found himself in a world far removed from the glitz of Tinseltown. He spent years working undercover, guarding top government officials, navigating through intense security details, and attending to the kind of delicate situations that rarely made the headlines. Yet, Clint never lost sight of his film career. He juggled both worlds with the precision of someone who had learned to thrive under pressure. By the 1980s, his double life as an actor and former agent had become a part of his persona. His roles in movies like In the Line of Fire, where he portrayed a Secret Service agent protecting the president, felt like second nature to him, but few knew how close the fictional tales were to his actual experiences. Behind the scenes, Clint had been working on some of the country's most important assignments, his face seldom seen in public, his work often kept under wraps. But in the courtroom today, Clint wasn't just any man, he was Clint Eastwood, the man who had seen the world from both sides, who had served his country quietly and without fanfare. And his past was about to collide with the present in a way no one could have predicted. Clint's role as a Secret Service agent wasn't the only part of his history that shaped him. His personal life had also been filled with challenges and triumphs that shaped his character. Clint had been married twice and had several children, both biological and adopted. While his career in Hollywood gave him fame, his personal life was often the subject of intense scrutiny. His relationships were sometimes rocky, marked by a deep-seated need for control and a desire for solitude, but Clint had always valued the importance of family. The lessons he learned from these relationships were key to his resilience, and they were now more important than ever. Clint wasn't just a former agent or an actor, he was a man of principles. His career had given him insight into the darker side of human nature, and his experiences as a father, husband, and public figure had taught him the value of perseverance. But it was his time with the Secret Service that truly solidified Clint's understanding of what it meant to serve, whether as a protector of the powerful or simply as a man who had been given the opportunity to make a difference. As he sat in the courtroom, the weight of his past seemed to hang in the air. The judge's mocking comments had only scratched the surface of Clint's life, but they had triggered something deep inside him. It wasn't about defending his legacy in Hollywood, nor was it about boasting about his time with the Secret Service. It was about something more important, respect. Clint had always valued respect, not just from the public, but from those around him. And as the judge continued to challenge him, Clint knew that this was a moment where his past was no longer a footnote in a biography, it was the key to shifting the power in this courtroom. He had dealt with criminals and politicians, starlets and agents, but today, Clint Eastwood would show that he was a man not to be underestimated, no matter the arena. The courtroom was unusually quiet, save for the rustling of paper and the soft shuffle of feet. The sudden shift in energy had not gone unnoticed. The mockery had subsided, but it wasn't over yet. Clint Eastwood had changed the dynamic in the room with one simple gesture, his U.S. Secret Service badge. It was as if the very foundation of the courtroom had been jolted. No longer were the spectators just watching a trial, they were watching an unfolding drama, one where Clint Eastwood wasn't merely a witness, but an enigma. Judge Harold Jenkins, though rattled for a moment, quickly regained his composure. His reputation for being unflappable was built on a foundation of confidence, and Clint's stunt wasn't going to break that easily. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and gave a half-smile. "Well, Mr. Eastwood," the judge said, his voice carrying a hint of forced calm, "it seems you have a way of surprising people. But we're here to focus on the case at hand, not your illustrious career in both Hollywood and the Secret Service." Clint didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the judge. His demeanor was cool, almost predatory, but there was an underlying current of something deeper, something that was hard to define, yet impossible to ignore. He knew this moment would set the stage for everything that was to come. He wasn't just here to testify about the past, Clint was here to reshape the narrative in this courtroom. "Your Honor," Clint finally spoke, his voice steady but carrying a weight of authority that seemed to echo in the silence, "I'm here because what happened in the past matters. It matters to the truth. It matters to the people I served. And it matters to this case." Judge Jenkins' smile faltered, but he quickly masked his surprise. He wasn't used to being challenged. "Well, then, let's get to it, shall we? We have a lot of ground to cover today." But the tension had already seeped into the proceedings. The shift in the room was palpable. Every word spoken by Clint seemed to have a ripple effect, making the situation more charged, more intense. His past, a complex web of history in Hollywood and the Secret Service, had come rushing back to haunt him. The judge may have been trying to steer the focus back to the case, but Clint knew better. The case was about to become secondary to something much more personal, something that had been lingering in the air since his entrance. And it wasn't just the judge who had been affected. The lawyers on both sides of the case were now aware of the gravity of Clint's presence. They had initially thought they were dealing with a simple celebrity witness, someone whose testimony would be wrapped in a neat little bow. But now, the courtroom was no longer a place for simple answers. It was a battleground. And Clint was the warrior. Across the courtroom, two opposing lawyers exchanged glances, their nerves barely hidden behind their professional facades. Linda Walters, the defense attorney, had been quietly skeptical of Clint's involvement from the beginning. She'd read the papers, seen the headlines, and heard the rumors. Clint Eastwood, former Secret Service agent, Hollywood legend, and now, a witness in this high-profile fraud case. It didn't make sense. But there was something about him, his confidence, his quiet authority, that made her uneasy. She wasn't the only one who felt this way. On the other side, Richard Shaw, the prosecution attorney, had been preparing for this trial for months. He had meticulously crafted his case, built on evidence, facts, and airtight arguments. But nothing had prepared him for Clint Eastwood walking into the room. Shaw had spent years studying every detail of the law, but Clint was an unpredictable element, one that neither side could fully account for. As Linda Walters stood up to make her opening remarks, she glanced over at Clint once more. He hadn't taken his eyes off the judge, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His composure only added to the tension. "I'll make this brief, Your Honor," Walters began, her voice smooth but her gaze still on Clint. "The defendant stands accused of defrauding millions of dollars. The evidence is clear. The only thing left is to understand what role Mr. Eastwood played in all of this, if any. We believe his involvement is negligible, and we will show that the facts speak for themselves." Richard Shaw rose to counter. "Your Honor, we have evidence that places the defendant at the scene of several criminal activities. Mr. Eastwood's testimony will serve as a critical piece of this puzzle. The defendant's ties to a network of fraudsters cannot be ignored." The battle between the lawyers raged on, each trying to make their case. But Clint's presence loomed large over the entire courtroom. Every time someone spoke, their words felt like an attempt to dance around the real issue. The real question was no longer about the defendant's guilt or innocence, it was about Clint Eastwood. His reputation, his history, his legacy, and how it all fit into the drama unfolding before them. As the trial went on, the tension only increased. The more Clint remained silent, the more everyone around him seemed to flail. Every word from the defense was met with quiet scrutiny, and every piece of evidence the prosecution introduced seemed to be swallowed by Clint's stoic aura. But it wasn't just the legal back and forth that had everyone on edge. The room seemed to crackle with anticipation, as though something was brewing just beneath the surface. Clint's cool exterior was hiding something. He had a reason for being here, something more than just fulfilling his role as a witness. The fact that the case was about to take a turn was evident to anyone paying attention. As the clock ticked on, Clint finally stood up to speak. The courtroom went silent as his voice filled the air, steady and firm. "Your Honor," he said, addressing Judge Jenkins directly, "I understand your skepticism. I understand why you think this is a joke. But I assure you, this isn't a movie, and I'm not here for your entertainment. I'm here to make sure that the truth is heard." The judge leaned forward, his face tightening. "What truth are you referring to, Mr. Eastwood? What do you think you know that we don't?" Clint's eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of something darker passing through them. He wasn't just a witness in this case, he was holding something back, something that would change everything. "I know," Clint replied softly, "because I've seen the people behind this case. And I know exactly what's going to happen next." The room fell into an eerie silence as Clint Eastwood's words echoed through the courtroom. The weight of his statement hung in the air, so thick that it seemed to press down on everyone present. Everyone, from the judge to the lawyers, to the spectators, was now waiting for Clint to elaborate. The tension had built up to a point where the simplest of gestures, the slightest change in expression, seemed to have the power to shift the entire direction of the trial. Judge Jenkins was the first to break the silence. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice steely but tinged with curiosity, "care to explain what you mean by that? What do you know that we don't?" Clint didn't immediately respond. His gaze shifted from the judge to the jury, his eyes scanning their faces. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, their hopes for a resolution, their desire for clarity. But Clint wasn't about to give them an easy answer. He wasn't here for the courtroom drama, not the kind the media might expect. He had a deeper purpose, one that had been brewing for years. For Clint, this wasn't just about the defendant or even about the case at hand. This was about something bigger, something that had been building ever since he'd stepped into the courtroom. He had learned, in his years with the Secret Service, to read people, to understand their motives, and to see through the facades they put up. And he had seen something in this case, something that wasn't just about fraud, it was about power, manipulation, and dangerous secrets that went far beyond the courtroom. He took a deep breath before speaking again, his voice carrying a weight that commanded attention. "I've been around long enough to know when something doesn't add up. This case is about much more than money. It's about who's pulling the strings behind the scenes. And I'm here to tell you that the person you think is at the center of it all, they're just a pawn." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some of the jurors exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to interpret Clint's words. The lawyers were equally caught off guard. Linda Walters, who had been calm and composed up until now, looked like she was trying to process what Clint had just said. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice slightly unsteady, "I think you're jumping to conclusions. This is a simple case of financial misconduct. There's no grand conspiracy here." Clint's eyes locked onto hers, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "You're wrong, Ms. Walters. This isn't about a simple case. There's a much larger game being played here, and it's been going on for years." The room seemed to hold its breath as Clint continued. "I've seen it before, in my work with the Secret Service. When you're dealing with high-stakes cases like this, it's never as simple as it seems. People with power don't just lose their grip on things overnight. No. They orchestrate these situations from the shadows, manipulating everything and everyone they can." Richard Shaw, the prosecution attorney, had been sitting back, letting Clint's words sink in. But now, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Eastwood, are you suggesting that the defendant is part of some larger conspiracy?" Clint didn't flinch. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you. The defendant is a small part of something much bigger. Someone is controlling the narrative, pulling the strings. And they'll stop at nothing to protect themselves." Judge Jenkins had heard enough. He slammed his gavel down, the sharp sound cutting through the tension like a knife. "Enough, Mr. Eastwood. This is not the time for your theories. We're here to deal with the facts, not your wild speculations. Clint stood there for a moment, unshaken. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. He'd been in situations far more dangerous than this, and he knew when to push and when to retreat. But now wasn't the time for retreat. He had to expose the truth, even if it meant challenging the system that had been built to protect it. Your Honor, Clint said, his voice calm but firm, I'm not here to make wild speculations. I'm here to make sure the truth comes out, no matter how uncomfortable it is for some people. There's a lot more at play here than you realize. The judge's face twisted into an expression of frustration, but Clint could see something in the man's eyes, a flicker of doubt, perhaps, or maybe even recognition. It was clear that Clint's words had struck a chord, but whether or not the judge was willing to acknowledge it was another matter entirely. The room remained tense, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. Clint had just dropped a bombshell, but no one knew what the fallout would be. Was he bluffing? Or was there some truth to his claims? As the minutes ticked by, Clint's mind began to race. He wasn't just talking about some abstract conspiracy, he was talking about a well-oiled machine that had been running for decades, and now, the gears were starting to grind against each other. He had seen it before, powerful people who thought they were untouchable, operating behind the scenes, manipulating the system to their advantage. But what Clint had also learned in his years of service was that no system, no matter how strong, was invincible. And right now, the cracks were beginning to show. He had no intention of backing down now. Clint had made it clear that this wasn't just a courtroom drama. This was a battle for truth, and he was willing to fight for it with everything he had. The prosecution team huddled together, whispering urgently among themselves. They were recalibrating, trying to understand Clint's angle, trying to decide whether to challenge him directly or take a more cautious approach. The defense, too, was in damage control mode. Linda Walters knew that Clint Eastwood wasn't just another actor. He had experience, and he wasn't easily intimidated. As the courtroom waited for the next move, Clint knew one thing for certain, this was only the beginning. The truth had been set in motion, and it would take everything Clint had to see it through. There were forces at play, people whose names would never be publicly spoken, whose influence could reach into the very heart of the government. And Clint was determined to expose them all. But as he stood there, waiting for the next step, he felt the weight of his own past pressing down on him. This was no longer just about a case, it was about redemption, justice, and the secrets that had been buried for too long. He had seen things that most people couldn't even imagine, but now it was time for those secrets to come to light. The room had grown impossibly tense. The air was thick with anticipation, and every person in the courtroom felt as if they were teetering on the edge of a precipice, waiting for the inevitable plunge into chaos. Clint Eastwood's calm but piercing words had shattered the facade of this trial, leaving behind only a tangled web of questions and unease. But just as the weight of his revelation seemed to hang in the air, the moment was about to take an even darker turn. Judge Jenkins, who had regained his composure, attempted to steer the courtroom back to order, but it was clear that the momentum had shifted in Clint's favor. He stood at the edge of the truth, his silence speaking volumes, but the next step would push the case, and the room, into uncharted territory. Clint could feel the tension. He had spent decades in situations where the truth was elusive, hidden beneath layers of deceit and manipulation. But here, in this courtroom, the truth was finally within reach. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. The prosecution, once confident and assertive, now seemed unsure of their footing. Richard Shaw, the lead prosecutor, leaned forward, his face etched with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. His voice was low, measured, but there was an underlying urgency to his words. Mr. Eastwood, Shaw began, his gaze never leaving Clint's face, are you suggesting that the person at the center of this case, the one we've been investigating, is part of a larger conspiracy? And if so, what exactly do you know about this conspiracy? Clint's eyes locked onto Shaw's, his expression unreadable. It was clear that this wasn't just a game of words anymore. This was a battle for control of the narrative. The stakes had just been raised. You want the truth? Clint's voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to it now, a certain edge that cut through the tension like a knife. I've seen the pattern. I've been part of the system long enough to recognize it when it's right in front of me. This case is just the tip of the iceberg. The real players are hiding in plain sight. The courtroom collectively held its breath as Clint's words settled in. There was something chilling about the way he spoke, as if he knew things that no one else could possibly understand. The entire room was suspended in that moment, and it was clear that the course of the trial had just taken a dramatic turn. But Clint wasn't done. He knew he couldn't stop now. He had to push forward, reveal the next piece of the puzzle, no matter how dangerous it might be. I'm not talking about simple fraud, Shaw, Clint continued, his voice growing more intense. I'm talking about something much bigger. Something that goes beyond this case, beyond this courtroom. The people behind this trial are involved in activities that could destroy everything we hold dear. And the defendant, he's just one of many players. A gasp echoed through the room. Linda Walters, who had been sitting quietly until now, shot Clint a look of disbelief. She couldn't wrap her mind around what he was saying. It didn't make sense. But something in Clint's eyes, the certainty, the weight of his words, told her that he wasn't bluffing. Mr. Eastwood, Judge Jenkins said, his voice strained as he tried to regain control of the room, I've had enough of these vague insinuations. Either you provide us with concrete evidence, or we'll have to proceed with this case based on the facts we have, not on whatever conspiracy theory you're suggesting. Clint's gaze never wavered. He knew that the judge was trying to maintain authority, to keep the courtroom focused on the case at hand. But Clint couldn't afford to hold back anymore. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. Evidence, Clint muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. He took a deep breath and then turned his attention back to the judge and the jury. You want evidence? I've got it. But I'm going to need your help. The sudden shift in his tone was unmistakable. Clint wasn't just talking about the case anymore. He was talking about something that reached far beyond this courtroom, something that involved a conspiracy of unimaginable scale. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air, and for a moment, no one knew how to react. I'm not here to entertain you with sensational stories, Clint said, his voice now low and measured. I'm here to bring the truth to light. But it's going to take more than just me standing here and talking. It's going to take all of you. The people who are sitting in this room, who are sworn to uphold justice. It's going to take your courage to see this through. There was a pause, and then the room seemed to come alive again. The lawyers, the judge, the jury, and the spectators, all of them were watching Clint with new eyes. They had come to see him as just another celebrity witness. But now, they saw him as something more, a man who had lived through darkness, who had faced down danger time and time again, and who now stood in the courtroom, ready to expose everything he knew. Clint's eyes swept over the room. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the uncertainty, the rising tension. He had just unleashed a bombshell, and the fallout was about to begin. But Clint was prepared for whatever came next. He had been through worse. And he wasn't backing down now. The defendant, who had been sitting quietly in the back, suddenly stood up, his expression a mix of anger and fear. This is a joke, he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. You're trying to make me the scapegoat for something I had nothing to do with. But Clint wasn't deterred. He stood tall, his gaze unwavering. You're right, Clint said quietly, you didn't do this alone. But you were part of it. And now, the truth is coming for all of us. The room fell silent once again. The emotional climax of the trial had arrived. The secrets that had been buried for so long were finally coming to light, and no one, not even the judge, could predict what would happen next. As Clint stood there, his mind racing, his heart pounding, he knew that this moment would change everything. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, the truth would be exposed. And there would be no going back. The courtroom was still, the weight of Clint Eastwood's words hanging in the air like a storm that had yet to break. The tension was palpable, thickening with each passing moment. Everyone waited for the next move. Clint's revelations had thrown everything into disarray, and the ramifications of his claims were far-reaching. It was no longer just a case of financial misconduct. It was a web of secrets, power, and corruption, and now the question was, who would dare to untangle it? Clint stood at the center of the storm, his heart pounding but his face composed. His experience with danger and deception had prepared him for moments like this, but even he couldn't deny that this was different. This wasn't just about his past with the Secret Service, this was about justice, about exposing a truth that some powerful forces had desperately tried to keep hidden. As the minutes passed, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. The judge, finally regaining his composure, looked down at Clint with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Jenkins began, his voice low and tinged with frustration, "you've disrupted this court with these accusations. If you have concrete evidence of this conspiracy you're alleging, you need to present it now. Otherwise, I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt." Clint knew that the time for words was coming to an end. He had made his case, dropped the bombshell, but now he had to back it up. The truth had to be revealed, and there was no turning back. Clint took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the papers in front of him. He knew that the next move would determine everything. "I've already told you," Clint said, his voice calm but firm, "this isn't just about one man. It's about a network of people who have been manipulating this case, using the defendant as a pawn to cover up their own crimes. If you want to understand the full extent of what's going on here, I can't do it alone. I need your help." The room fell silent once again. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. The jury was staring at Clint, their expressions a mixture of doubt and curiosity. Linda Walters, the defense attorney, was sitting motionless at her table, her gaze fixed on Clint. The prosecution, too, was on edge, unsure of how to proceed. Clint stood his ground, waiting for the inevitable response. He had to push for the truth, to expose the corruption that had been festering in the shadows for far too long. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. "We will adjourn for a short recess. Mr. Eastwood, you will remain here, and we will give you an opportunity to present any further evidence you may have. If you're truly going to claim that this case is part of something much bigger, then it's time for you to prove it." The gavel slammed down, signaling the recess. As the courtroom began to empty, Clint stayed seated, his mind racing. The weight of everything he had just revealed was starting to sink in, and he knew there was no going back. This wasn't just about this trial anymore. This was about bringing an entire network of corruption into the light. Linda Walters approached Clint as the room emptied, her expression unreadable. She stopped in front of him, her eyes locked onto his with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I don't know what game you're playing, but you're walking a dangerous line here. If you're wrong, if you can't back up what you've said, you'll have made an enemy of a lot of very powerful people." Clint met her gaze, unflinching. "I'm not here to make enemies, Ms. Walters," he said quietly. "I'm here to make sure the truth comes out. And trust me, it's going to." She studied him for a moment longer before nodding slightly. "You'd better be right," she muttered, before turning and walking away. Clint's heart rate had slowed, but his mind was still racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had set the wheels in motion, but now he had to follow through. The evidence, the proof, he had it all, but getting it into the right hands was going to be a challenge. There were forces at play far beyond anything he had anticipated. The recess lasted what felt like an eternity, but when the courtroom finally reconvened, Clint knew the time had come. He stood as the judge called the room back to order, every eye in the courtroom now focused on him. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the pressure to deliver the evidence that would validate everything he had said. Judge Jenkins took his seat, his expression stern. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, "the time has come for you to present whatever evidence you have. If you claim that this case is part of a larger conspiracy, then it's time to back it up." Clint nodded and stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. The truth was out there, but now he had to navigate the minefield of power, corruption, and manipulation to bring it to light. "I have something here," Clint began, his voice steady despite the storm swirling inside him. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a series of documents, photographs, emails, financial records, and transcripts, each piece carefully collected over the course of the investigation. He laid them out on the table for all to see. "This," Clint continued, "is the evidence you've been asking for. It's a paper trail, a chain of communications that leads directly to the individuals pulling the strings behind this case." He turned to the jury, his eyes scanning their faces. "These documents show how the defendant was used, manipulated into playing a part in a much larger scheme. And it's not just about this trial. It's about money laundering, illegal lobbying, and corruption that runs so deep that it's embedded in the very institutions meant to protect us." The room was quiet as the jurors began to examine the documents, the gravity of what Clint had just revealed beginning to sink in. But it wasn't just the jurors who were affected. The prosecution, the defense, even the judge, everyone in the room felt the magnitude of what had just been laid before them. Clint turned back to face the judge, his expression unwavering. "I've done my part," he said simply. "The rest is up to you." The judge looked over the documents, his eyes narrowing as he processed the evidence. It was clear now, Clint had been right. The conspiracy was real. The pieces were falling into place, and the truth was no longer a distant possibility. It was staring everyone in the face. Judge Jenkins sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as he looked up at Clint. "You've given us a lot to digest, Mr. Eastwood. But the truth is, you've just uncovered something far bigger than any of us anticipated. I'll have to call for further investigation into these matters." Clint nodded. He had done what he came here to do. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least now, the truth was out. And that was all that mattered. As the courtroom began to empty, Clint stood still for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had come to this case as an outsider, but now he was at the center of something much larger, a truth that had been buried for too long. And though the battle was far from over, Clint Eastwood knew one thing for certain: he had made a difference. The system had been shaken, and now, the real work could begin. The days following the revelation in court felt like an emotional roller coaster for Clint Eastwood. What had started as a simple desire to expose the truth had turned into something far greater. The consequences of his actions had rippled outward, affecting not just the trial, but every part of the world he had known. He had always been a man of conviction, one who believed in the power of the truth, but now he was facing the harsh reality of that belief. Clint had expected pushback. He knew that unveiling such a powerful conspiracy would not come without consequences. But what he hadn't anticipated was the magnitude of the reaction from those at the top, the people who had orchestrated the corruption, the people who stood to lose everything if the truth continued to unravel. They were not going to let this go easily. The phone calls began the morning after the trial. Clint's phone buzzed incessantly, but he ignored the first few. It wasn't until the sixth call, from an unknown number, that he decided to pick up. "Clint, we need to talk," the voice on the other end said, low and urgent. "It's bigger than you think. You've made a lot of enemies." Clint's stomach tightened. "Who is this?" "I can't say, but you know who I work for. The people you've upset, they're not going to back down." Clint didn't answer immediately. He had long been familiar with the idea of power working in the shadows. But hearing it from a voice so close to the heart of the storm was unsettling. "Are you threatening me?" Clint asked. "No," the voice replied quickly, "but I'm telling you, this goes deeper than you realize. If you want to survive this, you need to stop poking the hornet's nest. You've exposed a lot, but you're not ready for what's coming next. The line went dead before Clint could respond. He set the phone down, his thoughts racing. He had known that getting involved in this trial would bring challenges, but this was something else entirely. His revelation had drawn a line in the sand, and now it seemed that those who had been hiding behind the curtain were ready to retaliate. That night, Clint couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the events of the past few days. The trial, the courtroom, the explosive revelations. The truth had been exposed, but now there was a heavy weight pressing down on him, one that he hadn't anticipated. He was no longer just a witness in a case, he was now a target. The world outside his window seemed oblivious to the storm that was brewing. The stars twinkled in the clear night sky, a far cry from the tension he was feeling. Clint turned over in bed, his thoughts drifting toward the people who had trusted him, the jury, Linda, the defense team. They had all placed their faith in him, and now it was his responsibility to see this through. But how could he? The forces aligned against him were powerful, and it was clear that they weren't afraid to take drastic action to protect themselves. Clint was no stranger to danger, but this felt different. This was no longer about a trial, it was about survival. In the days that followed, Clint's life became a careful balancing act. He couldn't go back to the comfortable anonymity he had once known. The media attention surrounding the trial only increased, and the whispers of conspiracy grew louder. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him, watching, waiting, calculating his next move. And then the calls started. At first, they were nothing but vague threats, people warning him to back off before it was too late. But soon, the tone of the calls changed. Clint would answer his phone only to hear silence on the other end, or sometimes a voice that sounded eerily familiar. "Clint," one voice said, "you're playing a dangerous game. You have no idea who you're messing with." It was clear that Clint had stirred the hornet's nest, and now, the swarm was closing in. But Clint wasn't backing down. He had spent too much of his life standing up for what he believed in, and this moment would be no different. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions. His resolve grew stronger with each passing day, even as the weight of his newfound role as a target loomed larger. A week later, Clint found himself sitting across from Linda Walters at a quiet cafe in downtown Los Angeles. The conversation had been carefully arranged, and neither of them had spoken to one another since the trial. Clint had a lot on his mind, and Linda seemed to be the only person who could understand the magnitude of the situation. Linda sipped her coffee thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the room as if she were trying to remain inconspicuous. "You know, Clint, I never expected you to be the one to unravel everything. I always thought I was the one who'd have to do the dirty work in the courtroom, but you've got a way of getting to the heart of the matter." Clint didn't respond right away. The last few days had been a blur of uncertainty and mounting pressure. He had always respected Linda's intellect, but now he saw her in a different light. She had been part of this system, and she had her own battles to fight. "I didn't do it alone," Clint said finally, leaning forward. "But now that I've exposed the conspiracy, it's like I've opened a door that can't be closed." Linda nodded, her gaze turning serious. "You're right. But the people behind all this won't stop. And it's not just about you anymore, Clint. They're watching you, they're watching everyone involved in this case. It's going to get messy." Clint took a deep breath. He knew she was right. The system had been shaken, but it wasn't just going to fall apart on its own. It would fight back. And it would fight dirty. "So what now?" Clint asked. Linda hesitated for a moment, looking around before speaking in a low voice. "Now, we wait. You can't keep pushing like this, Clint. If you want to see this through, you need help. People in positions of power who can back you up. But you've made enemies with some very powerful people. I'm not sure who we can trust." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Then we find someone who can help. Linda leaned in, lowering her voice. You're playing a dangerous game, Clint. But you've already crossed the line. There's no turning back now. Clint nodded grimly. He knew she was right. Whatever came next, he couldn't stop now. The truth had been exposed, but the fight was far from over. The consequences were just beginning to unfold. As he left the cafe, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that his life had changed forever. There was no going back to his quiet life in the shadows. He was now in the spotlight, and everything he had done up until this point had led him to this moment. The stakes were higher than ever before, and Clint knew one thing for sure: the only way forward was to keep pushing, no matter the cost. Clint Eastwood wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting in his car, parked outside the small, unmarked building nestled between a liquor store and a pawn shop on a dimly lit street in Los Angeles. His fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as his mind raced. What was he doing here? Who could he trust now? Linda Walters had given him a name earlier that day, someone who could potentially help him navigate the storm that was brewing. A man named Vince Marlowe, a former intelligence officer turned private consultant. Clint didn't know much about Vince, except that he had connections to the kind of power Clint was up against. If there was anyone who could guide him through the labyrinth of corruption he was tangled in, it was Vince. But Clint had always been wary of people like Vince, individuals who lived in the shadows, who profited from the chaos that others found themselves trapped in. Clint had been on the outside of those circles, always focused on doing what was right, even if it cost him. Now, he was being pulled in, deeper than he'd ever been before. Clint finally pushed the door open, stepping out into the cool night air. His footsteps echoed as he crossed the cracked pavement toward the building. The door was unmarked, blending in with the surroundings, making it almost impossible to know it was there unless you were specifically looking for it. That was exactly what Clint had been instructed to find. He knocked 3 times, and after a brief moment, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. A man with a scar running down his cheek stood in the doorway. He was shorter than Clint had expected, but there was something intimidating about the way he held himself. His posture was rigid, like he was ready for anything. "You Clint Eastwood?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Clint nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I'm here to speak to Vince." The man stepped aside without a word, motioning for Clint to follow him inside. As Clint walked through the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a world he didn't fully understand. The air inside the building was thick with the smell of old leather and cigarette smoke, and the walls were lined with filing cabinets, each one seemingly filled with secrets. "You're gonna want to sit," the man said, pointing to a chair in front of a worn wooden desk. Clint took a seat, his eyes scanning the room, noting every detail. This place had a certain feel to it, like it had been designed to make you uncomfortable, to remind you that you weren't in control. A few moments later, the door at the far end of the room opened, and in walked Vince Marlowe. He was tall, with a clean-shaven face and short, graying hair. His eyes were sharp, calculating, as if he could see straight through Clint. "So, you're the one who's been stirring up trouble," Vince said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. He sat down across from Clint and studied him for a long moment. "I've heard a lot about you. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But let's make one thing clear. You're in over your head." Clint leaned forward, refusing to be intimidated. "I didn't come here for a lecture. I came here for answers." Vince chuckled softly. "And you think I have those answers? You're not the first person to ask for my help. People like you come to me all the time, people who've gotten in too deep and think they can just walk away with the truth. But that's not how this works, Clint. Not in this world." Clint's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't have time for games. I need to know who's behind this conspiracy. I need to know how deep it goes." Vince leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about one case, one trial. It's about an entire system, a system that's been running for decades. And you're just a small piece of the puzzle, Clint. A puzzle that, if you keep going down this road, will consume you. Clint's eyes narrowed. Then help me solve it. If you know what's at stake, then you know I can't just walk away. This is bigger than all of us. For a moment, Vince said nothing. He simply stared at Clint, as if weighing his next words carefully. Finally, he spoke. "All right, here's the deal," Vince said, his tone shifting from casual to serious. "I can give you some answers, but it's going to cost you. And not just money, this isn't a transaction. You're playing a dangerous game, Clint, and I don't know if you're ready for what's coming next." Clint clenched his fists. "What do you want from me?" Vince smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I want you to understand that there's no going back. Once you know what's really going on, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to your little quiet life, pretending you're just a bystander. You'll be in the thick of it, and there's no getting out once you're in." Clint stared at him, feeling a mix of fear and determination. "I'm already in, Vince. I don't have a choice." Vince's expression softened, just slightly. "You've got guts, Clint. I'll give you that. But don't say I didn't warn you." He reached into a drawer on his desk and pulled out a thick folder, sliding it across to Clint. "This is what you're looking for. It's everything I've got on the people you're up against. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it's a start." Clint picked up the folder, his heart racing. This was it. This was the key to everything he'd been fighting for. "Take it," Vince said. "But remember what I said. Once you open that door, there's no shutting it again." Clint stood up, his mind already spinning with the possibilities of what lay ahead. He knew that the road ahead would be dangerous, and he couldn't predict what was coming. But he had no choice now. The truth was out there, and it was his responsibility to uncover it. As Clint turned to leave, Vince's voice stopped him. "One more thing, Clint," Vince said, his tone softer this time. "You're not alone in this. There are others who want the truth to come out too. But trust is a rare thing in this world. Don't trust too easily." Clint nodded, slipping the folder into his bag. He didn't know what to make of Vince, but one thing was clear, the journey he had started was only getting more complicated. But Clint was no stranger to challenges. The game had changed, and now he had to play it to win. Clint Eastwood couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. With the folder Vince Marlowe had given him tucked under his arm, Clint found himself walking the streets of downtown Los Angeles, the weight of the documents heavy in his mind. The streets, bustling with the usual traffic and noise, seemed distant, like they existed in a different reality. His mind was occupied with far more dangerous matters, secrets, lies, and the ominous power structure that was threatening to tear apart everything he had fought for. The folder was filled with information that he knew he shouldn't have, but there was no going back now. Clint had been on the edge of something much larger than just the case he had gotten involved in. This was no longer about a trial. This was about exposing a covert network that had operated in the shadows for decades, spanning political power, law enforcement, and corporate interests. Clint had just stepped into the lion's den, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. As Clint walked aimlessly, his thoughts ran wild. Who were these people? Who stood at the center of it all? And most importantly, how could he get close enough to expose the entire network without losing his life, or the lives of those around him? His phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. The number was unfamiliar, but he recognized the voice immediately when he answered. "Clint, it's Linda." "Linda," Clint replied, his voice hoarse. "I've got the information. I've seen the depth of it. I don't know what to do with it." Linda paused on the other end, the tension evident even through the phone. "I've been thinking a lot about this, Clint. You're diving into something that could ruin everything. This is bigger than anyone realizes. But you don't have a choice now. You need to act fast. Clint ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. But what do I do with all of it? How do I make sure it gets out without getting killed in the process? You can't do it alone, Clint, Linda said. You need allies, and you need to be strategic. Trust me, people are watching you. Watching every move you make. There are eyes everywhere. Clint glanced around, his stomach twisting. He knew she was right. The constant feeling that he was being watched had become suffocating. Every person he passed on the street felt like a potential threat. You said something about allies, Clint said, his voice now tight with concern. Who can I trust? Linda hesitated. I've got a few names. People who are disillusioned with the system, just like you. But be careful, Clint. Some of them have their own agendas. You'll need to navigate carefully, or you'll wind up buried in the very thing you're trying to destroy. Clint nodded, though Linda couldn't see it. I'll be careful. I don't have much of a choice. Just don't make the mistake of trusting everyone you meet. It could cost you everything. Before Clint could respond, Linda ended the call, leaving him standing in the middle of the sidewalk, feeling more alone than ever. But there was no time for self-doubt. There was work to be done, and it was time to start unraveling the truth. That evening, Clint went through the folder in the privacy of his apartment, scanning the documents one by one. His eyes widened with disbelief as he flipped through evidence that detailed not only the individuals involved but also how far-reaching the conspiracy was. There were names he recognized, powerful individuals who had long since operated under the radar. Senators, CEOs, law enforcement officials, each of them connected to a vast network of influence and money that ensured their power would never be questioned. One name, in particular, kept standing out, Nathaniel Cross. A former FBI agent turned private contractor, Nathaniel had disappeared from public view years ago, but the file made it clear that he was a linchpin in the entire operation. It appeared he had orchestrated many of the corrupt activities Clint had uncovered, and his role was much larger than Clint had imagined. If Clint was going to bring this down, Nathaniel would be the key. But getting close to Nathaniel was going to be nearly impossible. The man had vanished from the public eye, and there was no easy way to track him down. Clint needed more than just information. He needed access. He needed someone who could lead him to Nathaniel. The following day, Clint met with one of the people Linda had recommended, an old contact of hers named Jessica Blake. Jessica was a former journalist who had been investigating similar corruption for years but had vanished from the public eye after receiving numerous threats. She had a reputation for uncovering secrets, but she was also cautious, well aware of the dangers that came with exposing the truth. The cafe where they met was nearly empty, save for a few scattered patrons. Clint had insisted on meeting in a public place, not wanting to take any chances. Clint Eastwood, Jessica greeted him as he approached the table. I didn't think you'd actually show up. You're not exactly the type to trust others with your life. Clint chuckled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Times are changing. I'm not exactly sure who I can trust anymore. Jessica leaned in slightly, her eyes scanning the room. You're not wrong. This game is dangerous. But if you're in, you're in. No turning back. Clint placed the folder on the table, watching as Jessica's eyes flickered over the documents. She didn't say anything for a moment, but Clint could see the way her brow furrowed. The weight of the situation was settling in. This is big, Jessica said quietly, flipping through a few more pages. I've seen these names before. But this is the first time I've seen the whole network laid out like this. Clint nodded. I need help, Jessica. You've got connections. I need to get to Nathaniel Cross. If I can find him, I can bring this all down. Jessica paused, her fingers resting on the folder. Cross is not someone you just go after. He's been underground for years. I've tried to track him down, but it's like he vanished into thin air. The people who move in his circles are ghosts, Clint. Clint's jaw tightened. I don't have time to wait. I need him now. Jessica met his gaze, her expression calculating. You're right. You can't do this alone. But you'll need more than just my help. If you're serious about taking down Nathaniel Cross and his network, you'll need to get into the right rooms. You'll need a team, people who know how to move in the shadows, just like them. Clint was silent for a moment, weighing the risks. I can't trust just anyone. You'll have to, Jessica replied, her voice firm. The question is, Clint, are you willing to pay the price? Clint didn't hesitate. I'll do whatever it takes. Clint Eastwood had crossed many lines in his life, but he had never felt this exposed. As he walked through the dark alley behind the cafe, his mind churned with the conversation he'd just had with Jessica Blake. She had given him the direction he needed, but the weight of what she had said was starting to sink in. To bring down Nathaniel Cross and the network behind him, Clint needed more than just determination. He needed allies. And finding the right people, people who could move in the shadows and keep their secrets, would be the most dangerous part of this journey. Clint's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Linda. I've got a lead on Cross's location. Meet me at the usual spot. Trust no one. His pulse quickened. The usual spot was a secluded park near the outskirts of town, a place where they'd agreed to meet in case things got too heated. It was a neutral zone, a place to exchange information without being watched. But even then, Clint knew it wasn't truly safe. There were eyes everywhere. He couldn't trust anyone completely, especially now. The park was empty when Clint arrived, the silence of the early morning hours hanging heavily in the air. The only sound was the faint rustling of the trees in the breeze, and the distant hum of traffic. Clint stayed in the shadows, watching every movement in his periphery. He knew better than to be careless. Linda showed up about 20 minutes later, her figure barely visible in the darkness. She moved with purpose, the way someone does when they know the risks involved in a situation. Clint stepped out of the shadows and met her near a bench. You look like you've seen a ghost, Linda said quietly, her eyes scanning the park. You've got that look in your eye, the one that says you're ready to burn everything down. Clint chuckled dryly, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. I'm getting close, Linda. I can feel it. But there's so much more to this than I thought. Cross isn't just some rogue agent. He's part of something bigger, something far more dangerous than I ever imagined. Linda nodded, her expression serious. I've been telling you that. I don't think you truly understood the depth of this until now. You're not just going after Cross. You're going after a whole network of people with far more power than you realize. People who have influence in places you wouldn't believe. Clint rubbed his temple. I know. I've got pieces, but I need the whole picture. And that's where you come in, Linda. You said you had a lead on Cross. Tell me where he is. Linda hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a folded piece of paper from her jacket. She handed it to Clint. This came from a reliable source. Cross is holed up in a secluded mansion in the hills, just outside the city. It's heavily guarded, but there's a back entrance. If you want to get close, that's your best shot. Clint took the paper, his mind already working through the possibilities. I'll need more than just an address, Linda. I need a way inside. I need to know who's working with him, who's protecting him. Linda paused, looking him over carefully. That's going to be a problem. The people who are working with Cross are all former high-ranking military and intelligence officials. Most of them are former CIA, NSA, or private contractors. And they're loyal to Cross, not to anyone else. Clint's eyes narrowed. Sounds like a well-guarded fortress. Exactly. And the worst part is, Clint, these people don't operate in the open. They're ghosts. There's no paper trail, no digital footprint. If you want to get to Cross, you're going to have to get creative. You'll need someone who can get you access to the kind of people who can break through all of that secrecy. Clint glanced at Linda, understanding the implications of her words. You know someone who can help with that? Linda gave a small nod. I do. But it's not going to be cheap. And it's going to put us both at risk. Clint didn't hesitate. I don't care. I need to get in there. Linda's eyes softened, just for a moment. All right. But once you're in, Clint, there's no going back. You'll be in the lion's den. No more hiding, no more playing it safe. Everything you've built, everything you've worked for, will be on the line. Clint knew she was right. He couldn't go back now. The pieces of the puzzle were almost in place. All he needed was the key to unlock the final door, and Nathaniel Cross would be his. The next morning, Clint made his way to the location Linda had provided, a seemingly ordinary bar tucked in the heart of the city. But Clint had learned long ago that nothing in his world was ever ordinary. He knew better than to trust appearances. Inside, the bar was dimly lit, with the hum of quiet conversations filling the air. Clint spotted the man he was looking for, an older, grizzled individual sitting alone at the far end of the bar. His face was obscured by the brim of a worn baseball cap, but Clint knew who he was. Jason King. A former military strategist who now worked as a freelance consultant for the highest bidder. Jason had a reputation for being able to move in and out of dangerous circles without ever leaving a trace. Clint approached him cautiously, aware of the risks involved. Jason didn't look up as Clint slid onto the stool next to him, but his eyes flickered just slightly, as if acknowledging Clint's presence. You Clint Eastwood? Jason asked, his voice rough, like he'd been smoking for decades. Clint nodded. I hear you're the man who can get me the information I need. I need access to Cross's network. Jason smirked, taking a slow drag from his cigarette. You don't ask for much, do you? I'm not here to waste time, Clint replied. You get me inside, and I'll make sure you're well taken care of. Jason studied him for a long moment, then leaned in closer. All right. But it's going to cost you. You need to understand, once you step into this world, there's no turning back. You don't just expose a man like Cross, you take down everything he's built. And you're going to have enemies. More than you can count. Clint didn't flinch. I'm ready for it. Jason nodded slowly. We'll see. You'll need someone on the inside who can get you close. I've got a contact. A woman who works for one of Cross's inner circle. She's been feeding me information for years. If you can get to her, she'll get you what you need. Clint leaned in, his eyes narrowing. Who is she? Jason looked over his shoulder, making sure no one was listening. Her name's Violet. She's dangerous, but she's the key. She's got information on Cross's every move. You get to her, and you'll get everything you need. Clint stood up, placing a few bills on the counter. Where do I find her? Jason grinned. That's the tricky part. She's a ghost. But I'll make sure you have what you need. Don't get caught, Clint. You're not just fighting Cross anymore, you're fighting an entire network. As Clint walked out of the bar, he knew this was only the beginning. The path to Cross had become more treacherous, and the stakes had never been higher. But Clint was committed. He would see this through to the end. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood didn't know exactly what kind of hell he had just walked into, but it was coming for him fast. After meeting Jason King and getting the information he needed about Violet, Clint's mind was spinning. He had a lead, something real this time. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that this entire situation was beginning to spiral out of control. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. More personal. More intense. The higher the stakes got, the clearer it became, there were no guarantees in this game. Clint had spent the next few hours digging deeper into the information Jason had given him, cross-referencing it with everything he had on Nathaniel Cross. Violet was, as Jason had warned, a ghost. There were no obvious traces of her existence, nothing to indicate her whereabouts, and yet, the whispers of her involvement were everywhere. She had ties to some of the most dangerous people in the world, and yet, she operated like a shadow, slipping in and out of the most secure places without anyone even knowing she was there. Clint's gut told him that Violet was more than just a woman with secrets. She was a key player in this entire mess, and she was the one person who could potentially help him unravel everything. But how did you find a ghost? How did you make someone like Violet trust you when you couldn't trust anyone yourself? The following evening, Clint stood outside a dimly lit club in an industrial part of Los Angeles, his heart pounding. This was it. This was where Violet was supposed to be. Jason had given him a name, one of her associates who frequented the club. If Clint was going to get to Violet, this was his chance. But the club was surrounded by the kind of people Clint had learned to avoid. Dangerous types. Thugs. Mercenaries. People who knew how to disappear when things went sideways. And he knew that no one walked through those doors without paying some kind of price. He checked his watch and entered the club, instantly enveloped in the pulsating rhythm of the bass-heavy music. The place reeked of alcohol, sweat, and something darker that Clint couldn't put his finger on. The crowd moved in a haze of lights, the bodies swaying to the beat, but Clint wasn't here for the party. He was here for information. Clint made his way through the crowd, staying low and focused. He wasn't sure who he was looking for, whether it would be someone who looked like they had something to hide or someone with a more open demeanor. All he knew was that Violet's contact would be here, and he had to make the first move. At the back of the club, he spotted a man sitting in a booth, a figure cloaked in shadows. His posture was relaxed, but the eyes were alert, too alert. He didn't belong here. Clint could tell immediately that this was the person Jason had mentioned. Clint walked over and sat across from him without asking for permission. The man didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed slightly, sizing Clint up. "Are you the guy looking for Violet?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Clint nodded, keeping his face neutral. "I need to talk to her. I've got information she'll want to hear." The man studied him for a long moment, then finally gave a slight nod. "She doesn't take kindly to strangers. But I suppose you've already figured that out, huh?" Clint didn't answer. He didn't have time for games. "Where is she?" he pressed. The man leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "You don't just get to walk in here and demand answers. Violet doesn't trust anyone. You think she'll just come running because you say so?" Clint leaned forward, his voice hard and steady. "I don't have time for this. I know who you work for, and I know you've been in contact with her. So, either you help me, or I can make sure your little operation here is shut down." The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you're in control? You're way out of your depth, friend. Violet doesn't take orders from anyone. And you're not going to change that." Clint's eyes flicked around the room, scanning the exits, the people, every angle. "I'm not here to give orders. I'm here to stop Cross and his network. If you don't help me, then we're both dead." The man's smile faded. "Cross? You really think you can stop him? You think you're the only one who wants to bring him down?" Clint felt a shift in the air, a sudden realization dawning on him. This wasn't just about getting to Violet. This man knew more than he was letting on. He was caught up in something bigger, something that had its claws deep in this whole mess. And Clint needed to figure out what that was if he had any hope of bringing Cross down. Before Clint could press further, a woman's voice cut through the tension. "You'll get your chance to speak with Violet, but not here." Clint turned toward the voice. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the harsh neon light, was a woman dressed in black, a leather jacket, dark sunglasses, and a presence that made the room feel smaller. She didn't need to introduce herself. Clint knew it was Violet. She had a certain aura about her, someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer, and had come out the other side sharper, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Violet stepped into the booth, sitting down across from Clint. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. You want information? You've come to the right place. But you better know what you're asking for, because once you have it, there's no going back. Clint met her gaze. I know exactly what I'm asking for. I want to take down Cross. And I need you to help me. Violet chuckled, leaning back in her seat, her eyes scanning him like she was appraising an asset, or maybe a potential threat. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're still playing in the shallow end. Cross isn't just some big fish to fry. He's the king of this entire underworld. Take him down, and you'll be taking down everything else with him. You ready for that? Clint didn't flinch. I'm ready. But I need to know how to get to him. Violet's expression hardened, and for a moment, Clint could see the weight of the decision in her eyes. She was deciding whether or not to trust him. But the longer she looked at him, the more Clint realized that trust wasn't going to come easy. If you're serious, Violet said finally, you'll do exactly as I say. No questions. No hesitation. You want Cross. You'll have to move faster than he expects. And you'll need help. I'll give you what you need, but be warned, Clint. The deeper you go, the more you risk losing everything. Clint nodded, his resolve strengthening. This was it. He was in it now, whether he liked it or not. Violet stood up, her eyes never leaving Clint. Meet me tomorrow. We'll figure out the next steps. But remember one thing, Clint, crossing lines has consequences. And in this game, there are no second chances. With that, she walked out, leaving Clint to consider what he had just agreed to. Clint Eastwood had always been a man of action, but even he had to admit that the stakes had never been higher. The world he was stepping into now, this world of shadows, betrayal, and power, was unlike anything he had faced before. Nathaniel Cross wasn't just a criminal or a rogue agent, he was the mastermind of a global operation that had its claws in every level of power. Taking him down wasn't just a mission. It was a declaration of war against something far bigger than Clint had ever imagined. And if Clint was going to survive this fight, he had to play the game the way Cross did, smart, cold, and without hesitation. The following morning, Clint met Violet at a nondescript diner on the edge of town. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to make a deal with someone like her, no smoky back rooms or hidden exchanges. Just a simple, faded sign that read Joe's Diner, with a couple of old men sipping coffee in the corner. Yet Clint knew better than to trust appearances. Violet had chosen this place for a reason. It was a safe neutral ground, where no one would be watching them. As Clint entered the diner, Violet was already sitting at a booth, her eyes scanning the room as though she knew exactly who and what to look for. She looked every bit the part of someone who had lived in the shadows for too long, her expression unreadable, her posture relaxed but alert. When she saw Clint, she gave a small nod, indicating he should join her. Clint slid into the booth across from her, his eyes narrowing as he took in her cool demeanor. He wasn't here to waste time. All right, he said, leaning in slightly, his voice steady. You said we'd figure out the next steps. What do you have for me? Violet didn't respond immediately. She took a slow sip from her coffee, letting the tension build between them. Clint knew that she wasn't someone who rushed into anything, especially not something as big as the game they were now playing. Finally, she placed her cup down and met his gaze. You want to take Cross down, huh? You think you're ready for that? Clint didn't hesitate. I'm not here to talk about it. I'm here to get results. Violet raised an eyebrow, almost impressed by his directness. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But here's the thing, Clint, Cross isn't some criminal mastermind who can be taken down with a few well-placed punches. He's entrenched in a system that's nearly untouchable. The only way to get to him is from the inside." Clint's mind raced. "And that's where you come in, right? You're already inside." Violet's lips curved into a small, wry smile. "You could say that. I've got my connections. My own way in. But I won't do it for free. You're going to have to trust me, Clint. And I don't give that trust easily." Clint felt a pang of discomfort at the word trust. He had been burned too many times in his career to trust anyone lightly. But right now, his options were limited. If he was going to get close to Cross, Violet was his only lead. "I don't have the luxury of time," Clint said. "I need answers. I need a way in." Violet leaned back in her seat, considering him for a moment. "Here's the deal. I've got a contact, someone who works directly for Cross. His name is Marcus. He's been with Cross for years, but he's starting to get a little restless. He's the kind of guy who values loyalty, but he's also a man who wants to get ahead. I know he's going to be at a private gathering tonight. If we can get to him, we might be able to flip him. The problem is, it's not going to be easy." Clint's brow furrowed. "A private gathering? What kind of gathering?" Violet's eyes darkened slightly. "It's an exclusive event. High-level people from all over the world, politicians, CEOs, former intelligence officers. It's where Cross does most of his deals. If we can get Marcus alone, we might have a shot. But it's going to take some serious preparation. And that's where you come in, Clint." Clint nodded. He was already calculating the risks in his head. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he didn't have much of a choice. This was the break he needed. If he could get to Marcus, maybe he could find a way to get to Cross. "I'm listening," Clint said, his voice low and focused. Violet slid a folder across the table toward him. "This is everything I have on the event. The guest list. The layout of the venue. Even the security protocols. It's a high-stakes game, Clint. One wrong move, and it's over. But if you're careful, if you play your cards right, you'll get your chance to talk to Marcus." Clint flipped open the folder, his eyes scanning the information quickly. Everything was detailed, too detailed, almost. Violet had clearly done her homework. But even with all the information in front of him, Clint knew this wouldn't be a walk in the park. This was a world he wasn't used to navigating. But he didn't have the luxury of backing out now. He had a job to do. "Who else is going to be there?" Clint asked, already thinking about how he would handle the situation. "Other than the usual crowd?" "A few people who can help us, if you're smart about it," Violet replied. "One of them is a former intelligence officer named Eric Hall. He has a history with Cross, but he's not entirely loyal. If you can work your charm on him, he might give you more than Marcus. He's connected to a lot of the covert operations Cross has been involved in." Clint rubbed his chin. "And how do you suggest I get close to this guy?" Violet's lips curled into a sly smile. "That's where you'll need to use your talents. You've got the look, Clint. The charisma. And you've got the experience. But be careful. Hall's got a sharp mind, and he's not easily fooled. If you get in too deep, it could blow up in your face." Clint's eyes hardened. "I'm not afraid of getting in deep. I just need a way in." Violet's eyes darkened, a flicker of something dangerous flashing across her features. "That's the spirit. But remember, Clint, once you get inside, you're in the game for real. Cross doesn't care about your loyalties. He doesn't care about anything but winning. If you want to take him down, you'll have to play by his rules, or better yet, break his rules." Clint sat back, digesting her words. He didn't like the idea of bending to anyone's rules, especially Cross's. But if it meant getting closer to his ultimate goal, he would do what he had to do. "I'll be ready," Clint said firmly, closing the folder and sliding it back to Violet. "When does this gathering take place?" Violet stood up, her expression turning businesslike. "Tonight. I'll get you inside. Just be careful who you trust." As she turned to leave, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a cliff. One wrong move, and everything he had worked for would come crashing down. But he had no choice. He had to take that step. He had to go in. That night, Clint prepared himself for what was sure to be the most dangerous gamble he had ever taken. He knew that the deeper he went, the more perilous this would become. The world he had stepped into was no longer black and white. It was a maze of lies, trust, and betrayal. But for the first time in years, Clint felt alive with purpose. As he stood before the entrance to the venue, his heart raced. He was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Clint Eastwood arrived at the venue, a sleek, imposing mansion on the outskirts of Los Angeles. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where high society mingled, where the rich and powerful convened behind closed doors to make deals that shaped the world. But Clint knew better. This wasn't just another lavish party. This was where the real power players made their moves, the kind of moves that could change everything. And he was about to step into that world, uninvited, under the pretense of being one of them. The security was tight, as expected. Guards at every corner, high-tech surveillance cameras scanning every inch of the perimeter, and the kind of exclusive access only granted to those with the right connections, or the right amount of money. But Clint wasn't here to blend in. He was here to get close to Marcus, and if things went according to plan, he would also make a play for Eric Hall. The only problem? He had to be careful. One slip-up, one wrong move, and it would all be over. Inside, the mansion was as opulent as he had imagined, crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and walls adorned with expensive art. The guest list was a who's who of the world's elite, politicians, CEOs, former intelligence officers, arms dealers, the kind of people Clint had spent his life hunting down. It was a place of influence, and he was here to disrupt that. Clint adjusted his black tie, walked past a pair of suited guards who scanned him with practiced eyes, and headed toward the grand hall. He didn't bother with pleasantries. This wasn't the time for small talk. He had a mission, and he was going to execute it with precision. As he made his way deeper into the mansion, his mind raced. He was supposed to blend in, to be just another faceless attendee. The trick was not to attract attention but to get close enough to Marcus and Eric Hall without anyone realizing who he truly was. The first person Clint encountered was a well-dressed woman in a deep red gown who was standing near a group of men discussing business in low, conspiratorial voices. She glanced at Clint and smiled politely. "I don't think I've seen you here before." "You must be one of the new faces," she said in a voice that was both flirtatious and calculating. Clint forced a smile, playing the part of a charming, well-heeled businessman. "I'm just getting my foot in the door, trying to make the right connections," he said smoothly. She tilted her head, sizing him up. "Well, you've come to the right place," she said, her eyes gleaming with interest. "We all love fresh blood, don't we?" Before Clint could respond, the sound of a man's voice broke through the conversation. "You're wasting your time with him, Grace." The woman turned, slightly annoyed, to see a tall, broad-shouldered man approaching. His sharp features and cold eyes told Clint everything he needed to know. This was Marcus, the man who could lead him to Cross. Clint instantly straightened up, his posture stiffening. Grace gave Marcus a tight-lipped smile. "You're just jealous because you know I always have better taste in men than you." Marcus ignored her completely, his eyes now locked on Clint. "I didn't expect to see someone like you here," he said, his voice low and dismissive. "Who are you, really? You don't strike me as the usual kind of guest." Clint's mind raced. He had to keep his cover intact, he couldn't afford to slip now. Just someone looking to make the right connections, like everyone else, Clint said, offering a handshake. The name's Clint. And you are? Marcus didn't take the handshake. Instead, he raised an eyebrow. You don't know who I am? He seemed mildly amused, as if Clint's ignorance was either insulting or simply laughable. I prefer to judge people by what they do, not by their names, Clint responded smoothly. He could feel the tension in the air as Marcus studied him. Well, Clint, Marcus said finally, you'll want to be careful about where you're stepping. This isn't a place for amateurs. Before Clint could respond, Marcus turned away, signaling to one of his associates who stood nearby. As Marcus walked off, Clint felt the distinct sense that he'd just dodged a bullet. He watched as Marcus disappeared into a private hallway at the far end of the room. That was his chance. Marcus was alone, moving away from the crowd. Clint's pulse quickened. This was it. He needed to follow him. But just as he began to move toward the hallway, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Trying to run off without saying goodbye. It was Grace again, her eyes narrowed. Clint turned to face her, forcing a smile. I was just looking for the restroom. Long night. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she gave him a knowing smile. Be careful, Clint. Marcus doesn't like people who try to get too close. You're not the only one trying to get ahead in this place. Clint nodded, playing it cool. Thanks for the advice, he said, and turned quickly, walking toward the hallway Marcus had just entered. Clint followed cautiously, making sure to keep a safe distance. His heart was pounding. This was his moment. He reached the end of the hallway and saw Marcus entering a private study, disappearing inside. Clint's instincts told him to wait. He needed to time this right. After a few minutes, Clint approached the study door and pressed his ear to it. He could hear the murmur of voices, Marcus, along with another man. Clint's pulse quickened. Was this the moment he would get his first real lead? Was Marcus about to reveal something important? He glanced around quickly. The hallway was still empty. He didn't have much time. Clint silently turned the handle of the door and pushed it open just a crack, enough to see inside. He could barely make out Marcus's voice. You know why I'm here. Cross wants to see how this is going to go down. If we don't deliver, there are consequences. The second voice, gruff and deep, responded. I know the stakes, Marcus. But you're playing a dangerous game. Cross has a plan for this whole operation. You don't want to get in the way. Clint's heart raced. This was it. He couldn't make out all the words, but he had heard enough. They were talking about Cross. This was the opening Clint needed. He was so close now he could taste it. Just then, the door creaked slightly, and Clint froze, holding his breath. Inside, the voices stopped. The room was deathly quiet. Without warning, a figure appeared in the doorway, and Clint instinctively stepped back, heart hammering in his chest. You're making a mistake, Clint. Clint froze. The voice was familiar, and it sent a chill down his spine. It was Violet. Clint's heart slammed against his chest as Violet stepped into the doorway of the study, blocking his only exit. Her eyes locked with his, betraying nothing, no warmth, no hostility, just the cold, calculating look that Clint had come to know well. He was taken aback, but his years of training kicked in. He kept his face impassive, not giving away any trace of surprise or confusion. Violet, Clint's voice was steady, though his mind raced. He had trusted her, and now, here she was, the last person he expected to find at the center of this tangled web. She wasn't just a contact or a source, she was someone deeply embedded in the operation. That much was clear. What the hell are you doing here? Clint's voice remained low and calm, despite the storm of questions swirling in his head. I didn't expect you to show up, not like this. Violet didn't move, her gaze unwavering. "You're in over your head, Clint. I told you to be careful, didn't I?" Her tone was as cool as ever, though Clint noticed a slight edge to her words. "Is this some kind of setup?" Clint asked, narrowing his eyes. "You've been playing both sides the whole time, haven't you?" Violet's lips curled into a half-smile, but it wasn't the smile Clint had come to expect from her. This one was sharp, almost sinister. "You think this is a game, Clint? You think you can just walk in here, take down Cross, and walk out without consequences?" She stepped closer, closing the distance between them, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're too late. The wheels are already in motion." Clint took a step back, his mind spinning. He had to think fast. Violet's sudden appearance didn't make sense, not unless she had her own agenda. He was sure of one thing now, he wasn't just a pawn in this game, he was being played by someone much more dangerous than he realized. "Why?" Clint asked, his voice hardening. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Violet shrugged, unfazed. "Because you wouldn't have believed me, Clint. You're too busy trying to play the hero." She took a step toward him, her eyes cold but intense. "But here's the reality, you're outmatched. Cross is always 2 steps ahead. You can't just take him down with your fists and your old tricks." Clint felt a surge of anger, but he kept it in check. This wasn't the time to lose control. If Violet was playing him, he had to turn the tables. "I'm not walking away from this, Violet. I'll get to Cross, with or without you." Her smile faltered, just for a split second, before she regained her composure. "And I'm sure you'll try, Clint. But here's something you should know, I never really cared about Cross. I never cared about taking him down. I care about something much bigger." The words hung in the air, pregnant with meaning. Clint was on the verge of asking her what she meant when a voice from inside the study cut through the tension. "Violet, who's your friend?" The voice was Marcus's, smooth and deliberate, laced with curiosity. He was standing at the other end of the room, watching the exchange with keen interest. Clint's pulse quickened. He had to make a decision. Was Violet working with Cross all along? Or was she caught in something far bigger than either of them? "I told you to be careful, Clint," Violet repeated, her eyes flickering toward Marcus before returning to Clint. "This place isn't what it seems. Marcus isn't just Cross's associate, he's more than that. And you're going to want to know what's really going on if you want to survive this." Clint's mind reeled. She was saying too much now. This wasn't just about Cross anymore. This was about something deeper, something far more dangerous. Marcus's voice broke the silence again, this time with a touch of amusement. "I can tell you're a bit confused, Clint. But trust me when I say, nothing is what it seems in this business. We all have our secrets." Clint turned to face Marcus, his thoughts swirling like a storm. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes locking with Clint's. "You're asking the wrong questions. What you should be asking is who's really pulling the strings. Cross. He's a pawn, just like everyone else. We all are." Clint felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. "What are you saying? Who's behind this?" Marcus's smile widened slightly, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "You'll find out soon enough, Clint. But first, you need to understand something important. Trust no one. Not even Violet." The words hit Clint like a physical blow. Trust no one. He had trusted Violet, trusted her to be his ally, but now he wasn't so sure anymore. Was she playing him the whole time? Or was she herself being manipulated? Violet stepped back, her arms crossed as she watched Clint, as if waiting for him to process the weight of Marcus's words. "It's bigger than you think, Clint. This is about control. Control of the government, control of the media, control of the people. And Cross isn't the one in charge. He's a part of a much larger operation, one that's been running for decades. Clint's mind raced. The stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. He had always thought he was up against a criminal syndicate, a rogue operation gone rogue, but this? This was something different. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still so much Clint didn't understand. "You're not going to get away with this," Clint said, his voice steady, but his eyes filled with fire. He wasn't ready to give up just yet. "Whoever's behind this, whoever you're working for, it's over." Violet sighed, a flicker of something regretful crossing her face. "I'm not the one you need to worry about, Clint. But you will, soon enough." Marcus chuckled darkly. "Enough with the theatrics. The point is, Clint, you've got two choices. You can keep fighting this, keep pushing for the truth, keep exposing everyone for what they are, but eventually, you'll end up just like the others." Clint's mind was a blur. He couldn't just walk away. He had come too far. He had to find out who was really behind this, who had been manipulating everything from the shadows. But there was a dark realization sinking in, one that he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. This was a fight for survival. "I'm not done yet," Clint said, his voice firm and determined. Violet's expression softened, just for a moment. "I hope you're right, Clint. Because once you start down this path, there's no turning back." Clint knew she was right. He was already in too deep. Clint stepped back into the mansion's hallway, his mind on fire with questions. He couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had settled in his gut after his conversation with Violet and Marcus. The words they'd spoken kept echoing in his head, each one like a whisper that hinted at a truth too dark to fully comprehend. It was bigger than Cross. Far bigger. Whoever was pulling the strings was playing a dangerous game, and Clint had become a pawn in that game, whether he liked it or not. He needed answers, and fast. But the path ahead wasn't clear. He wasn't just dealing with Cross anymore. He was dealing with a network of people who were far more powerful, far more dangerous, and far more calculated than anyone he had encountered in his career. The stakes had never been higher. Clint's fingers hovered over his earpiece as he stepped into the mansion's grand ballroom. He could feel the tension building, like the calm before a storm. The high society minglers still chatted and laughed, oblivious to the dangerous game being played behind the scenes. To them, this was just another night in paradise, another night of wealth and excess. But for Clint, this was a ticking time bomb, and the clock was running out. He clicked the earpiece into place. "Sophie," he muttered under his breath. She was his contact on the outside, his only ally in this mess. She was supposed to be monitoring the situation, watching for anything that might give them a lead. "Clint, I'm here." "What's going on?" Sophie's voice crackled through the earpiece, her tone calm but with an edge of concern. "I just spoke with Marcus." "And Violet," Clint trailed off, his words heavy. He wasn't sure how much he could trust Sophie anymore. Even with her, there were layers of doubt, layers of uncertainty that had begun to form over the course of the mission. But for now, she was his only connection to the outside world. "Marcus? Violet? What did they say?" Sophie asked, her voice tense. Clint glanced around the ballroom, watching as the guests continued their conversations, unaware of the impending danger. He needed to be careful, to play his cards right. They know more than they're letting on. This isn't just about Cross. Marcus is tied to something bigger, something far more dangerous. And Violet. I don't know if I can trust her anymore. Sophie's voice went quieter, the concern in her tone growing. "Clint, be careful. You're in deeper than you think. I've been tracking their movements, and there's something off about this entire operation. Cross isn't the head of it all. I think we're dealing with a far more organized network." Clint stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" Sophie paused before speaking again, the weight of her words heavy. This whole operation, Clint. It's not just about illegal deals or arms trading. It's political. It's military. And they're using the wealth and power of people like Cross to fund something much bigger, something that could change everything we know. Clint's blood ran cold. So it's a coup. A full-scale takeover. It could be. I can't say for sure, but the evidence points in that direction. Whoever is behind this, Cross or whoever controls him, they're pulling strings across the globe. They've got eyes and ears everywhere. You need to be careful. Clint clenched his jaw. He had suspected it, but hearing Sophie confirm it was like a punch to the gut. If what she was saying was true, then he was up against a far more powerful enemy than he had ever faced. This wasn't just about taking down a criminal syndicate. This was about stopping an empire from rising. I'll be careful, Clint muttered, his gaze shifting as he noticed Marcus entering the room, flanked by two burly men who looked like bodyguards. The trio made their way toward a group of powerful-looking men in tuxedos. There was no doubt in Clint's mind, this was the meeting he'd been waiting for. Sophie's voice broke through his thoughts. Clint, you need to get out of there. This is bigger than you realize. If Marcus is meeting with those men, they're talking about something that could affect national security. Get what you can, but get out. Clint's hand tightened around the edge of his glass. The risk was enormous, but he had no choice. If he backed out now, he might never get another chance. I'm not leaving without answers, he said, his voice resolute. Stay with me, Sophie. Keep tracking. If anything goes south, I need to know. I'm right here, Clint. Just be careful. He ended the conversation and made his way toward the group, moving through the sea of guests as discreetly as possible. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his face neutral, his movements calculated. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was part of the game now, and he needed to play it well. As Clint approached the group, he could hear snippets of their conversation. They were discussing something in hushed tones, codes, locations, and a project that Clint couldn't quite decipher. We have to make sure the next phase goes smoothly, one of the men said, his voice low but firm. If it doesn't, all of this could collapse. And we're not in a position to fail. Another man nodded. Cross can handle the cleanup, but we need to ensure the public is on our side. The media must not be allowed to paint this as an act of terrorism. We need to control the narrative. Clint felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure what they were planning, but it was clear that whatever it was going to be catastrophic. He couldn't let them get away with it. He moved closer, trying to overhear more, but suddenly, a firm hand landed on his shoulder. Clint froze. Clint Eastwood, said a deep voice that sent a jolt through his body. Clint turned slowly to see Marcus standing behind him, his smile thin and predatory. I knew I'd find you here. What are you really after? Clint swallowed hard, but he didn't flinch. Just enjoying the evening. Like everyone else, he said, offering a forced smile. Marcus wasn't buying it. He leaned in, his breath cold against Clint's ear. You should leave, Clint. You're out of your league. If you're not careful, you might end up in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we both know how that goes. Clint met his gaze head-on, refusing to back down. I don't plan on leaving until I get what I came for. And believe me, Marcus, I'll get it. Marcus chuckled, his expression icy. We'll see about that. As Marcus walked away, Clint's thoughts raced. There was no turning back now. He had seen enough to know that this was bigger than just a fight against a criminal syndicate. This was about stopping something that could alter the course of history. The stakes had just been raised, and Clint knew that in order to stop this deadly alliance, he would have to trust no one, not even himself. He had to be more than just a soldier now. He had to be a tactician, a strategist. Every move counted. And one mistake could cost him everything. Clint's breath came in ragged bursts as he sprinted down the hall, adrenaline surging through his veins. The mansion's labyrinthine corridors twisted and turned, each corner offering only the illusion of escape. His mind raced as he calculated his next move, knowing that every second mattered. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted. No longer just a player in this deadly game, he was the prey. He pushed open a door to his right, finding himself in a small, dimly lit study. The space was lined with bookshelves, a few scattered chairs, and a large mahogany desk. The room was silent, but Clint could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the hallway behind him. He had no time to waste. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. A window. That's what he needed. He spotted a large pane of glass across the room, but it was far too high to reach without help. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, their rhythm steady, calculated. He had seconds, maybe less. Clint's hand tightened around the handle of the desk drawer in front of him, his instinct screaming at him to act fast. He pulled it open, only to find the drawer empty except for a few papers. His heart sank. He was running out of options. But then, something caught his eye. A small, brass key sitting in the corner of the drawer. His fingers closed around it instinctively, and in that moment, he knew exactly what it was for. The key wasn't just an artifact. It was part of the mansion's hidden network of escape routes, hidden doors, secret passageways. Whoever owned this place had planned for just this sort of emergency. And Clint? Well, he'd just stumbled into one of the greatest secrets of the house. With no time to waste, Clint bolted toward the far side of the room, the key clenched tightly in his fist. The footsteps were close now, too close. He reached the wall and found the small, brass keyhole near the baseboard, barely noticeable beneath the dark wood paneling. It was a small detail, easy to miss unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. With one swift motion, Clint inserted the key and twisted it. The wall gave a soft groan, and with a shudder, a hidden door swung open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit staircase leading downward. Without hesitation, Clint slipped inside, shutting the door behind him just as he heard the heavy footsteps pass by. The basement smelled musty, the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Clint paused, listening intently, his breath still ragged from the chase. The sound of the footsteps had stopped. Were they searching for him upstairs, or had they noticed his escape? He couldn't afford to wait and find out. He had to move fast. The stairwell descended deeper into the mansion's heart, and Clint's mind raced as he thought about his next move. Violet's warning kept echoing in his head. "You're in too deep, Clint. Get out before it's too late." But there was no turning back now. He had seen too much. He knew too much. He had no choice but to keep pushing forward. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, Clint found himself in a small, low-ceilinged corridor. The walls were lined with old paintings and faded tapestries. The air felt colder here, as if the mansion itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Clint's footsteps were silent as he moved deeper into the space, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his side. He didn't trust anyone, not Marcus, not Violet, and certainly not the men who had tried to capture him. At the far end of the corridor, Clint spotted a large, iron door. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years, the hinges rusted and the paint chipped. His instincts told him that this was no ordinary storage room. Whatever was behind that door was far more important than anything else in the mansion. With a quiet creak, Clint pushed open the door, his eyes narrowing as he stepped into the room beyond. The sight that greeted him was unlike anything he had expected. The room was enormous, its walls lined with high-tech equipment, monitors flickering with streams of data. In the center of the room, a large table was covered with maps, blueprints, and files. But it wasn't the technology that caught Clint's attention. It was the large, glass-enclosed chamber in the middle of the room. Inside, suspended in a low-hanging, transparent pod, were multiple vials filled with a dark, ominous liquid. Clint's pulse quickened as he walked closer to the glass. The labels on the vials were written in code, but it wasn't hard to guess what they contained. The project Violet had warned him about. The one that could change the world as they knew it. A low hum filled the room, and Clint turned just in time to see a figure step from the shadows. The man was tall, dressed in a black suit, his face hidden in the darkness. His presence was commanding, and Clint's instincts screamed that this was no ordinary adversary. "Who are you?" Clint demanded, his voice low but steady. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes glowing with an unsettling calm. "I've been waiting for you, Clint," he said, his voice smooth and confident, as if he had expected Clint to arrive at this exact moment. "You've come a long way, but now, you've reached the point of no return." Clint's hand hovered over the gun holster, but he didn't draw yet. "Who the hell are you?" The man smiled, the expression chilling in its ease. "I'm the one who's been controlling everything. Cross, Marcus, Violet, all of them are pawns in my game. But you, Clint, you're the final piece of the puzzle." Clint's heart sank. It was worse than he thought. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just a player in this game. He was the mastermind, the architect of the chaos Clint had found himself caught in. "You don't have to do this," Clint said, his voice a mix of defiance and desperation. "There's still time to stop this." The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. "No, Clint. There is no stopping it. You're already too far in. And now, you're a part of the plan." Before Clint could react, the man pressed a button on a small device in his hand, and the room suddenly flooded with bright lights, blinding Clint for a moment. When his vision cleared, he found himself surrounded by armed guards, their weapons trained on him. The trap had been set. And Clint had just walked right into it. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as the blinding lights dimmed, his eyes adjusting to the harsh glow of the room. He tried to move, to fight, but the cold, metallic click of a dozen weapons pointed directly at him froze him in place. The guards, dressed in tactical gear, were moving quickly, circling around him like sharks. Their movements were practiced, fluid. This was no ordinary team of hired guns. These men were professionals. The man who had spoken earlier, the one who seemed to be orchestrating everything, stepped closer, his cold eyes never leaving Clint's face. His expression was unreadable, but Clint could sense the arrogance, the unshakable belief that he was in control of this situation. "You're in over your head, Clint," the man said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "This was never about you. It was always about the bigger picture. You were just the catalyst we needed. A piece of the puzzle that we didn't know we needed, until now." Clint clenched his fists, his mind working overtime as he processed the situation. He couldn't let fear take over. He had to stay sharp. If he was going to get out of this alive, he had to keep thinking fast. "So this is it?" Clint said, his voice rough, but steady. "You're going to lock me up and throw away the key? You think I'm just going to sit here and play along with whatever game you're running?" The man smirked, his hands folding neatly in front of him. "It's not about playing along, Clint. It's about survival. You think you're the first person to think they can stop us? You're not. But unlike the others, you might actually stand a chance, if you're smart enough to know when to quit." Clint's blood ran cold as he realized that, for the first time, he was face to face with the mastermind, the one pulling all the strings. This wasn't just a criminal operation. It was something far more sinister, far more dangerous than anything he had encountered before. "Who are you?" Clint asked again, his voice sharper now. "What's your endgame?" The man's smile widened, though there was no warmth in it. "I am the endgame," he said, his voice dripping with confidence. "Everything that's happening here, the chaos, the manipulation, the control, it's all part of a plan that goes back decades. You think Cross was just a pawn? No. He's a necessary part of a much larger scheme. A scheme that's been building for years, and you've just stumbled into the heart of it. Clint's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the man's words. Everything he thought he knew about the situation was crumbling. The people involved weren't just criminals looking for power. They were part of something much bigger, a global operation with roots in politics, finance, and maybe even warfare. I'm not just going to sit here and wait for you to do whatever it is you plan to do, Clint said, his jaw set. He was standing in the belly of the beast now, and he wasn't going to let himself be swallowed up by it. The man's eyes flickered for a moment, as if weighing Clint's resolve. Then he nodded. Very well. You'll have your chance, Clint. But I'm warning you, there's no way out of this. You won't win. You can't. Clint wasn't about to let fear dictate his next move. He had been in worse situations before. He had gotten out of worse situations before. And no matter how bad it seemed, he wouldn't stop now. He couldn't. There were too many people's lives at stake. The man gestured to one of the guards, who stepped forward, unlocking a heavy iron door that Clint hadn't even noticed before. The door creaked open, and the guards began to usher Clint toward it. You're not going to kill me? Clint asked, his voice still laced with defiance. The man raised an eyebrow. Not yet. You're far too useful for that. We have plans for you, Clint. Big plans. As Clint was led down the narrow corridor beyond the iron door, his mind worked furiously. He didn't know what kind of plans this man had for him, but he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to be part of whatever sick experiment they had in mind. The corridor was cold, the walls damp with moisture. It was like something out of a nightmare, claustrophobic and oppressive. The silence was broken only by the soft shuffle of their footsteps as they moved deeper into the labyrinth. Where are you taking me? Clint asked, his voice steady, though he could feel his nerves starting to fray. To the holding cells, the man replied, his tone casual. Where you'll be kept until we decide what to do with you. Don't worry, Clint. It won't be for long. Clint's mind raced as they approached a set of metal doors. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Whatever was waiting on the other side, he had to be ready. He had to find a way out, and fast. The door swung open, and Clint was shoved roughly inside a small, windowless room. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening clang, and for a moment, Clint was left in complete darkness. He paced the small space, the walls closing in on him. The air was thick, oppressive. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had to think, he had to. A voice broke through the silence. It was faint at first, but Clint's sharp ears caught it. It was coming from behind one of the walls, muffled but clear enough for him to make out the words. Help, please. Clint froze. Someone else was here. He pressed his ear to the wall, straining to hear more. The voice was weak, desperate. Whoever it was, they were in pain. And Clint realized something, he wasn't alone in this place. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a way out. With newfound determination, Clint moved to the far corner of the room, scanning every inch of it for a possible escape route. There had to be a way out. He wasn't going to let them break him. Not yet. Clint's heart hammered in his chest as he pressed his ear to the cold, damp wall. The muffled voice from the other side was faint, but he could hear the desperation in it. Whoever was on the other side, they were in trouble, and Clint couldn't ignore that. Not now. Not after everything he had already endured. He took a deep breath and pulled away from the wall. The guards had left him alone for now, but that wouldn't last forever. He couldn't sit idly by, not with the growing tension and the voices in his head urging him to move. Time was running out, and every passing second felt like an eternity. The walls of the holding cell were closing in on him. Clint turned around and began to inspect every corner of the room, every inch of the walls. There had to be something, some hidden door or secret escape route. His fingers traced the surface of the walls, running over the concrete, looking for any signs of a weakness. His mind raced as he remembered the labyrinth of corridors and hidden passageways he had glimpsed earlier. The mansion wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. And Clint had no doubt that whoever was behind this operation had thought of everything. But there had to be a crack in the armor. There always was. He checked the floor, running his hands across the rough tiles. It was a gamble, but Clint had learned long ago that the only way out of a place like this was to fight for it. And that meant finding any possible means of escape, no matter how small. Then, just as he was about to give up, Clint's hand brushed against something cold and metallic near the corner of the room. His heart skipped a beat. There it was, something different. A faint line, a seam, running along the edge of the floor. He knelt down, examining it more closely. It wasn't just part of the floor, it was a hidden trapdoor. Clint's pulse quickened as he realized what he had found. This was it. The opportunity he'd been waiting for. He quickly set to work, using his fingers to pry at the seam, trying to get a better grip. His hands were shaking with the effort, but his mind was focused, his thoughts clear. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The voices from behind the wall were growing louder, more frantic. Whoever was on the other side, they needed help. He needed to act fast. With one final tug, the trapdoor creaked open, revealing a dark passage below. Clint's breath caught in his throat. He didn't hesitate. He scrambled down into the passage, his hands gripping the sides of the walls as he descended into the unknown. The passage was narrow and winding, and the air was thick with the musty scent of old stone. Clint's mind raced as he moved through the darkened corridor, knowing that every step took him deeper into the heart of the mansion. There was no turning back now. As he moved forward, Clint could hear the distant echo of footsteps above him. His heart leapt into his throat. Had the guards discovered his escape? Were they coming after him? He didn't have time to worry about that. He had to focus on getting out of here, on finding the person who had called out, and on surviving whatever the man behind all of this had planned for him. The passage seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning like some sort of maze. But Clint was determined. He was resourceful. He had come this far, and he wouldn't let fear or uncertainty stop him now. Finally, after what felt like hours, the corridor opened up into a large chamber. The air in the room felt fresher, less suffocating. The walls were lined with shelves, some filled with old books, others with strange, unfamiliar artifacts. In the center of the room, there was a heavy wooden table covered in papers and files. Clint hesitated for a moment, scanning the room for any signs of danger. It was quiet, too quiet. But his instincts told him to keep moving. There was something important in here, something that might give him the upper hand. He moved quickly, scanning the papers on the table. Most of them were indecipherable, written in a mix of codes and jargon that Clint didn't recognize. But one document caught his eye. It was a map of the mansion. His eyes widened as he studied it, realizing that it showed hidden rooms and passageways he hadn't known about. This was the key. If he could get to the escape routes on this map, he might just have a chance. His hand hovered over the map, but before he could grab it, the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor behind him. Someone was coming. Clint cursed under his breath, his heart racing. He had to move. He grabbed the map and stuffed it into his jacket, just as the door to the chamber swung open with a loud bang. Two guards stepped inside, their weapons aimed directly at Clint. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, smirked at Clint as he stepped forward. "You think you can escape?" the man sneered. "You're not getting away from us." Clint's mind raced. The map in his jacket was his only hope, but the guards were closing in. He had to act quickly. Without warning, Clint lunged forward, knocking over a nearby table. The guards were momentarily distracted, giving Clint just enough time to dive for cover behind a stack of crates. He could hear them shouting, but he didn't look back. He was too focused on one thing, surviving. His fingers brushed the cold metal of a handgun in his jacket. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Clint reached for it, his heart pounding in his ears. The sound of footsteps grew louder as the guards began to search for him. Clint knew that they wouldn't stop until they had him cornered. But Clint wasn't going down without a fight. He stood, gun in hand, and aimed at the guards. His heart was racing, but his hands were steady. There was no turning back now. If he was going to get out of here, he'd have to make it count. "You want to play this game?" Clint said, his voice steady. "Then let's play." The guards hesitated, unsure of how to react. Clint used that moment of uncertainty to his advantage, charging forward and taking out the first guard with a swift strike to the chest. The second guard fired, but Clint was quicker. He dove for cover again, and when he peeked out, he saw the guard reloading. This was his chance. With a burst of energy, Clint sprinted toward the guard, knocking him to the ground and disarming him in a single motion. The guard's weapon skidded across the floor, but Clint didn't waste any time. He grabbed it and aimed it at the man, his voice low and commanding. "Move," Clint ordered. "Now." The guard raised his hands in surrender, and Clint didn't hesitate. He quickly moved toward the door and out into the corridor. The map was still in his jacket, and with it, his only hope of escaping this nightmare. But as Clint disappeared into the darkness, one thing was certain: the game was far from over. He had just taken the first step, and the road ahead was going to be even more dangerous. Clint's breath came in short bursts as he navigated through the winding corridors of the mansion, his mind focused on the map he had hidden in his jacket. The walls seemed to close in on him, the dim lights casting eerie shadows that seemed to follow his every move. He had escaped the holding cell, but now he had to make it out of this nightmare alive. The guards were on his tail. He could hear their voices in the distance, their footsteps echoing through the halls. They were getting closer. He had no time to waste. Every second counted. As he rounded a corner, Clint spotted a narrow staircase leading downward. His heart skipped a beat. The map had shown a hidden exit somewhere beneath the mansion, a way out. This was it. He had to trust the map. He had no other choice. His fingers tightened around the gun in his hand as he descended the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. The air grew colder the further he went, the damp smell of underground tunnels filling his nose. The walls of the staircase were made of rough stone, the passage twisting and turning like the veins of the mansion itself. Clint knew that if he could reach the exit, he could disappear into the night. He'd be free. But getting there wouldn't be easy. He reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself in a dark, cavernous space. The underground tunnels stretched out before him, their end hidden in shadow. There was a door at the far end, its metal frame battered and old, but Clint could see a faint light spilling from the crack beneath it. It had to be the exit. He moved quickly, his pulse racing as he approached the door. The sounds of the guards above him faded as he focused on the task at hand. He couldn't afford to make a sound. He couldn't afford to slip up now. But just as he reached for the handle, a voice called out from the shadows. "You really think you can escape, Clint?" Clint froze, his hand hovering just above the door handle. He knew that voice. He turned slowly, his gun raised, ready for whatever was coming. The man who stepped out of the darkness was the last person Clint expected to see. It was the mastermind, the man who had orchestrated everything from the start. The one who had manipulated everyone into playing his game. The one who had almost killed him in the courtroom. "I'm not here to play games anymore, Clint," the man said, his eyes cold and calculating. "You're too valuable to let go. You've seen too much. You're involved now. And I can't let you walk away." Clint's grip tightened on his gun, his finger itching to pull the trigger. He wasn't going to let this man control his fate. Not after everything he had fought through. "I don't think you understand," Clint said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. "I'm not here to follow your rules anymore. You had your chance. Now, I'm taking control." The man's lips curled into a smile, though it was devoid of warmth. "You think you can outsmart me, Clint? I've been planning this for years. You're just a small part of something much bigger." Clint narrowed his eyes. He wasn't interested in hearing more of the man's twisted plans. This wasn't about his schemes anymore. It was about survival. It was about getting out. "You're making a mistake," Clint said, his voice cold. "You've underestimated me." Before the man could respond, Clint darted forward, slamming his shoulder into the door and throwing it open with a crash. He sprinted into the darkness, not looking back. The man's shouts echoed behind him, but Clint didn't stop. Not this time. The underground tunnel was long, but Clint didn't have the luxury of time. He pushed forward, his feet pounding against the dirt floor. The light ahead grew brighter, signaling that he was close. But with every step, he could hear the sound of footsteps behind him, growing louder, closer. The guards were after him. They were closing in. Clint's mind raced as he searched for a way to outsmart them. He couldn't outrun them, not in these narrow, winding tunnels. But maybe he didn't have to. He spotted a small alcove to his right, a space between two large stone pillars. Without hesitation, he darted into it, crouching low and holding his breath. The sound of footsteps grew louder, but Clint remained perfectly still. His body tensed, his muscles coiled like a spring. A moment later, the first guard ran past him, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Clint's pulse raced. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, but he didn't move. He couldn't afford to make a sound. One by one, the guards passed by, their footsteps fading into the distance. Clint waited until the last of them had passed before he moved again, creeping out of the alcove and back onto the path leading toward the exit. He could see the faint outline of a door in the distance. Freedom. But just as he reached the door, a sudden voice pierced the silence. "You're not going anywhere, Clint." Clint spun around, his gun raised, but it was too late. The mastermind was standing in front of him, blocking the exit. His face was twisted into a cruel smile, and Clint could see the satisfaction in his eyes. "You should have stayed out of this, Clint," the man said, his voice dripping with malice. "But now, you've sealed your fate." Clint's mind raced. He had one chance. One shot. If he hesitated, he was dead. In a split second, Clint made his decision. He fired. The bullet hit the man square in the chest, and he fell backward, his body crumpling to the ground. The silence that followed was deafening. Clint stood frozen, his gun still raised, his chest heaving with exertion. The world seemed to slow around him, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had done it. He had taken down the man who had tried to end his life, the man who had orchestrated everything. But there was no time to celebrate. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. The guards were coming. Clint turned and bolted toward the door, his heart racing. He could see the night sky through the crack in the door, the cool air beckoning him to freedom. He pushed the door open with all his strength and stepped outside. The cool night air hit him like a wave. He took a deep breath, the weight of everything that had happened crashing down on him. He had survived. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Clint turned and ran into the darkness, knowing that he had to keep moving. There was no looking back now. The road ahead was uncertain, but Clint had made it this far. And nothing, was going to stop him now. The night air was cold against Clint's skin, the chill biting through the thin fabric of his shirt as he sprinted through the woods. His lungs burned with each breath, but he refused to slow down. He had come too far to let this slip through his fingers now. The mansion, the guards, the threats, they were all behind him. But the real battle, Clint knew, was far from over. With the map still clenched tightly in his jacket pocket, Clint's mind raced. The mastermind had fallen, but the operation he had orchestrated was much larger than just one man. There were others out there, watching, waiting. Clint couldn't allow himself to believe that just taking down the leader had solved anything. He knew better. The sound of his footsteps crunching against the leaves was the only thing he could hear, his mind too focused to notice anything else. The faint glow of a distant streetlight in the far-off town was the only beacon of civilization in the vast expanse of wilderness surrounding him. He had to keep moving. He had to get to safety, regroup, and figure out his next steps. But something gnawed at Clint's gut. That voice, the voice of the mastermind, kept echoing in his head, "You've seen too much. You're involved now." Clint had been in enough dangerous situations to know when someone was telling the truth. And there was no denying that the web he had stumbled into was deeper than he had ever imagined. As the trees thinned out and the terrain flattened, Clint saw the glint of headlights in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. His escape had been hard-earned, but now, it was time for the real reckoning. He moved off the path, blending into the shadows, trying to control his breathing. The headlights drew closer, a car speeding toward him. Clint tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun tucked into his waistband. If the wrong person was behind the wheel, he'd have to fight again. The car slowed as it approached him, and Clint's muscles coiled, ready to spring into action. But as it pulled into view, his eyes widened in recognition. It was not a foe, but an ally, a figure from his past. A figure Clint had hoped he wouldn't need to see again so soon. The car's engine idled for a moment before the window rolled down, revealing a familiar face. It was Detective Sarah Jacobs, the one person Clint had trusted most before this whole nightmare began. She looked as composed as always, but her eyes betrayed a hint of worry. Her hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and the expression on her face was one of cautious relief. "Clint," Sarah said, her voice low but steady. "You look like hell." Clint let out a sigh of relief, though it was tinged with bitterness. He had known this day would come, but seeing Sarah here, now, meant that the story was far from over. She had been there for him once, back when the case first broke, and now she was back again, just as tangled in this web as he was. "I don't have time for small talk," Clint said, glancing over his shoulder nervously. "There's still a lot at stake. They won't stop coming after me, Sarah." "I know," she said, her tone serious. "That's why I'm here. I've been following the breadcrumbs you left behind. I know what happened in that mansion. What you uncovered. But Clint, you're not the only one in danger. There's more at play here than just you. It's bigger than both of us." Clint frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to process her words. More at play. What did she mean? He didn't have the luxury of a long conversation, but he had learned to trust Sarah with his life before. Now, he needed to trust her again. "What do you mean, bigger than both of us?" Clint asked, his voice low, urgent. "Sarah, I've seen enough to know that this isn't just some criminal syndicate. This is something more. Whoever is behind this, whoever was pulling the strings, it goes all the way to the top." Sarah hesitated, her eyes flicking around the area nervously before meeting Clint's gaze. "I don't know all the details, Clint. But I've uncovered something, a connection between the organization you just took down and powerful people in the government. People who have been pulling strings from behind the scenes for years." Clint's stomach twisted at the thought. Powerful people. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was a whole new level of terrifying. This wasn't just about corrupt businessmen or petty criminals. This was something that could shake the very foundation of the system he had once trusted. "You've got to be kidding me," Clint muttered, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm not prepared for this. I can't fight this alone." "You're not alone, Clint," Sarah said, her voice soft but resolute. I'm with you. And I can help you get the information you need to bring this down. But we have to be careful. The people we're up against don't play by the rules. They'll do anything to protect themselves. Clint nodded, his mind still spinning. There were too many unknowns, too many dangers lurking in the shadows. But one thing was clear, there was no going back. I can't do this without you, Sarah, Clint said, his voice serious. But if we're going to take these people down, we need to move fast. They'll come after us. They'll come after anyone who gets in their way. I know, she said, her hand reaching into the glove compartment and pulling out a small flash drive. I've been working on getting more intel. This, she said, holding up the drive, contains information that could blow the whole operation wide open. But we can't take it to the authorities. Not yet. The wrong person will get their hands on it, and we'll be back at square one. We need to go off the grid. Clint took the flash drive, weighing it in his palm. This was it, the key to everything. With this, they might have a fighting chance. But only if they could stay ahead of the game, stay one step ahead of those who wanted to silence them. We've got to lay low, Clint said, his mind already racing with the next steps. We can't trust anyone, not yet. We'll take the information and disappear for a while. If we can gather enough evidence, we might just have a chance to bring them down once and for all. Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. I'll help you get what you need. But Clint, no more lone wolf acts. We're in this together. You hear me? Clint met her gaze, a rare moment of sincerity passing between them. Together, he agreed. He got into the car, and the two of them drove off into the night, the shadows of the world they were entering closing in around them. The battle ahead would be long, and the enemies they faced would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But Clint knew one thing for sure, this was only the beginning. The fight for justice, for truth, was far from over. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?